You're listening to the Enhance Learner Voice project. I'm your host, Rachel Ryan, the Head of Communications at EACEA, the National Adult Learning Organisation in Ireland. In this podcast series, we'll be hearing real stories from adult learners and educators involved in community and adult education across Europe. The podcast is part of the Enhance project, a European Commission-funded initiative that brings together partners from all over Europe. And through this project, we're developing tools and strategies that support educators, organisations and policymakers to put learner voice at the heart of adult education. We truly believe that your voice matters, and by sharing your story, you can inspire others to learn, teach and lead in more inclusive and empowering ways. Well, today I am delighted to be joined by Rosalind Threadgold. She is the Access and Inclusion Officer at Waterford and Wexford Education and Training Board here in Ireland, and also the coordinator of the My Voice, My Choice project. Rosalind, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you for making the trip to come and see us and to tell us all about your fantastic project. So for anyone who has never heard of My Voice, My Choice, can you give us a little synopsis of what it's all about?
Okay, so My Voice, My Choice was designed, co-designed and created for learners with an intellectual disability. So these learners would be typically going to adult day services after school and may have not had the options to go to further or higher education in the past. And I suppose we were looking at ways of including those learners and giving them some power and autonomy. So I suppose it's a bit of a social justice project, designed and co-created. When I say that, the new directions policy in adult day services meant that we were to empower people to make their own choices about their lives and to use the day service more as a hub, as opposed to a place where they stay during the day. So it was literally to be a base for them to go to other places, like, you know, ordinary lives, ordinary places out in the community. So some of those learners would like to go and do work experience, their sports, their activities, and, you know, using money, getting around, those normal things that we all enjoy. Sometimes they haven't had those opportunities in the past. So My Voice, My Choice was about empowering people to make decisions about their own lives. So I suppose it was maybe inspired by having a son who has an intellectual disability and seeing that he was very interested and motivated to be on the advocacy council within his own day service. So I suppose he would be an ambassador. And again, learning from that people communicate in different ways. Non-speaking does not mean non-verbal. It means that we might communicate in a different way. So it was about having a look at what they do really well in the day services, learning along the way from different projects we've done in the past, and making a course designed with and for the learners about making their own decisions.
Great. I mean, it does literally what it says on the tin, My Voice, My Choice. And would I be right in saying, Rosalind, it's a relatively still kind of new school of thought for people with intellectual disabilities, this idea of giving them autonomy and, you know, decision-making power over what they do with their own life, with their own time, you know, because for years in the past, really, things were just decided for them and dictated to them. Do you think it's, I mean, obviously, the new school of thought is happening, but do you think there's still a way to go? Like, this is the start of building on that?
I think there's an absolute huge way to go. Those normal things that we do every day, using your own money and making your own choice about going to work, not going to work, what work you go to, what options you have. Now, I've seen a huge transformation within the day services. They've worked so wonderfully in doing person-centred planning, and that would be led by the learner, or I call them learners, they're my learners, but by the individual themselves to make their own choices about how their life will go. And, you know, we were working especially with people who were maybe 21 plus. So they have a right to all the things that everybody else has the right to. And it was about maybe discussing and empowering those decisions, how to make good decisions. We all need to maybe think about how to have safety in our decision making. Who is our circle of support? Who can we call on if we're not sure about things? But was really about empowerment. It was about enabling and empowering those normal and everyday experiences. And there has been a wealth of development in the space in the last couple of years. And places like Inclusion Ireland have developed ambassadors and information and resources and videos and even podcasts. So we were able to draw down those learners' voices that were across the country and, let people see themselves in the images. A young person with Down syndrome talking about his job in Spar, or, somebody working in Mr. Price, or looking at people being ambassadors for themselves and having those normal everyday opportunities like everybody else. But yes, it is still, there's huge barriers, there's huge structural barriers to that.
But we're kind of on the right track. I guess what it is almost a mindset change for the individuals, but also for society as well. Like that's kind of a journey, I suppose, that we're all on, is changing that kind of mindset. And like I said, I have a sister with additional needs as well. And it's funny, probably in the last 10 years, a lot of this has come about, this kind of autonomy over her own decision making. And it can be difficult for the individuals themselves who maybe up until recently have had things dictated to them or had a lot of decisions made on their behalf. How have you found that in exploring, the My Voice, My Choice program, like of teasing out of the individuals, what it is they want from their life? Like, what is that job they want? What is that hobby that they want to do? Because sometimes I think when you've never been asked your whole life, if you've never had to think about it, it can be a bit daunting.
Well, there was a couple of challenges there, and I suppose the main one was, and we set it for ourselves, usually we would have community education or literacy programs, and people would come from one centre or one base, and they would come to ourselves or we would go to them. And there's lots of different opportunities for education. But what we did is we set out to actively recruit different learners from different day services across Waterford. So I suppose we looked at bringing people who had never been together before together. And what we asked them, I suppose, was that they had a good interest in advocacy. And that, so I suppose we had to think about how were they getting to college. First of all, we based it in a college with really good collaboration between ourselves and C2. And we had to think about how are they going to get there. How are we going to maybe factor in our lunchtime so that we can do, using our own money and, seeing how things were going. But we had a huge diversity amongst those learners. We had older learners who would have had a very different experience growing up and, and that piece of autonomy. We had people who were working. We had people that were spending very little time in the day services. And we had people who were spending an awful lot of time in the day services. So it was really hard to think about what can I do for this person or what can I. So we had to get the learners involved to help us. We had to have our open-ended questions, but it was ultimately about their lives and what their next step was and what their next goal was, and one of those goals might have been just to get to the college and get back by their own self, and sometimes I go into that language because, sometimes we would use our plain English and things like that and easy to read resources, but a lot of that empowerment pieces was about finding out from them what they wanted to do, and they were very diverse but very practical actually. I think at the age of 21 they have a good idea about, where they could see themselves. And if they can see more people like themselves doing these ordinary jobs in ordinary places, then they can see themselves in that too.
And do you think, obviously Learner Voice is really at the heart of the programme, the learners seeing, their peers opening up and, sharing their experience and what they want helps them to open up as well?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes, you would have very vocal learners and you'd have very quiet learners. But I think they could all see all of their self-esteem was good in the fact that it was about them, and I was asking them, and they had to do their own individual piece of work around it. So there was no right or wrong answers once there was an elaboration and an investigation. But when they did put down a plan, we were looking at the practical strategies to get there. You know, so it was a case of, so what would be your next step? You know, who would you contact? Who would you ask to help you? Would you work with your key worker on this? Is it in your person-centred plan? You know, and I mean, that's the way I'm speaking to you, but it might have been, you know, a little bit easier for them. But it was the same thing, really. It was plotting out how they were going to use these new powers of advocacy to make change in their own lives.
And so tell us a little bit about the kind of the practicalities of, you know, if a participant comes to the programme, what it looks like for them. You know, are they spending a few weeks planning out their, you know, putting a lot of thought into their own personal plan and then putting it in action? You know, how long do they stay within the programme? Like, do they always stay in the programme? How does it work practically?
Okay, so it was literally 2 semesters of the programme, and in the first place, we were really lucky to get some funding through ALL. So thank you, Edel and ALL and the ALL strategy, because that really empowered us to get laptops and things, which was assistive technology, C-pens, things like that.
And that's Adult Literacy for Life programme?
Yes, yeah. That's right. Yeah. So we went to C2. We got a most fabulous room, which was really good, to really college feel, you know. And you know, we even had a look at we had a look at that and said, well, we had 2 wheelchair users and it was upstairs, so we had to change that, and that was our first advocacy project. Let's get to a room that's more suitable for us. You know, we didn't want it to be dependent on the lift, things like that. We got our student cards then, you know, so that was another piece. The student services came to us instead of us going to them. It was great, and they took our pictures and supported us in every way they could. Then there was, you know, settling into the college. So it was about, you know, getting down to break, coming back up from break. But what really surprised me, I suppose, is I had expected the education to be a bit lighter, but the guys were hungry for this. I mean, they wanted to get down, they wanted to do the writing, they wanted to do, like, they were very dedicated to the work. And again, it was on topic. So there was 2 modules which helped change it up as well, you know. So there was the personal decision making, and then there was the IT skills. So we were doing computer literacy to support us, so that we could use multiple ways of engaging with the materials and resources. So that was really good. You know, we were doing 2 things. They were very motivated from the very start. There was nobody ever out. There was nobody ever late. You know, they were working, and we'd have to go, oh, it really is time for a break. You know. Now we did use universal design throughout, so I suppose it was multiple ways of engagement, multiple ways of action and expression, and multiple ways of communication. So that kept it vibrant.
And could you tell us a bit about those different universal design? Like, what exactly were they? Was it sort of visual aids? Was it conversation surveys? How did you go about it?
Well, I suppose we used multiple materials. We used the laptops. We used the YouTubes. Sometimes we used singing. You know, we might, if we felt the mood drop, we might do some karaoke.
You can't go wrong with that.
Well, you can't, because it's literacy. It's very literacy rich. And, you know, if people kind of know a tune, they have empowerment, they have decision making, they've got negotiation. You know, it can't be my tune the whole time. So I suppose there was, we did access audit of the building. So that was another way of engaging with it and talking about advocacy. We did another piece where we did a conference for Inclusion Ireland. So we did poster presentations. So we did mixed media. We ended up collaborating with the students in C2. So I suppose that came by chance. We were down in the canteen, and the guys were making friends right, left and centre, and a tutor knew one of our learners, and she was like, we need to collaborate. Do you need to collaborate? And we said, yeah, of course we need to collaborate. And they were doing creative studies. So they invited us to come along on Fridays. And I said, well, look, you know, we're under a bit of pressure here to get some work done. So we're going to do this Inclusion Ireland. It's about access to our community and barriers to that access to the community. So what we did then was we came up with a joint lesson plan for our learners and theirs. And I suppose what was on the table for us is that we wanted the C2 learners from social care to be engaged with the social model of disability, the UNCRPD, rights-based approach, because we were terrified that all this empowerment was maybe going to be taken off us by being over-supported in our pieces, and of course it wasn't. So, you know, the guys came, they spoke about identity. They had a commonality on identity and what makes up our identity. And, you know, that's about maybe going and getting my hair done. Maybe that's about getting my nails done. Maybe that's about going to the pub or going to a quiz or watching soccer or following a team. And it was about people understanding that we're all the same, you know, we all have interests and we need to be able to follow those interests. And sometimes, you know, people with intellectual disabilities, and this is in the mild to moderate range, you don't see them in the pub. You know, unless they're, you know, and they have to be in the pub by this time and getting collected at that time, and, you know, like it's an event and there's probably, you know, a lot. So I suppose it was about maybe people having to stop and think, why do we not see people in the ordinary places? Why don't we see them in where we work? Why don't we see them, you know, in our colleges? And how important it is, you know.
That social inclusion piece is so important, you know. And it's interesting you say that, because I worked on another project a few years ago about people with additional needs and that. And absolutely we need more representation in work and school and colleges. But it's in that social space, I think that it's most interesting, because it's going down to that pub and, you know, you're not seeing too much neurodiversity there. And if there are social activities, sometimes they're quite infantilized, you know, that it's quite like, you know, let's have a disco in the middle of the day for 2 hours. And it's like, it doesn't suit everyone. It might suit some people. So that social inclusion piece, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And I found that too. You know, I suppose that'll be one of the challenges. And you're trying to make sure people are safe, you know, and they have capacity. But it's about giving that capacity, and it's about handing over the power and saying, okay, let's do it if that's what you want to do, you know. I mean, we had people who had relationships within the course, and, you know, and all of that's very normal, you know. And I suppose some really fantastic moments were when we went down to the canteen one time. One of our learners was like, oh, hi. I don't remember the other learner's name, but they had gone to school together. You know, the 2004 Act had been enacted. You know, learners before that point had been refused from mainstream schools. They were just refused, you know. They had the UNCRPD behind them, but they were told no. You know, we were sent away from 4 schools. So I suppose, I know it's lived experience that this lad who had gone to mainstream school and, you know, been a game changer within, and then he was meeting some of those guys from his mainstream school in college, happened to pass into him in the canteen, you know. So that was a fantastic moment. Or another time, you know, we happened to be there for Rag Week. So, you know, there was great crack in the canteen and stuff. So, and I suppose I saw a great transformation and a great increase in the comfort level of other students within the building.
Yes.
You know, at the start, they were so polite and, you know, they were standing back and holding doors and, you know, whereas it became very normalised to see, you know, us coming with maybe 2 wheelchairs and, you know, mobility aids and, you know, great lot of chatter and great fun. And it was very normalised and very ordinary for the other learners. And I think was great for everybody.
It's brilliant to see, because that integration piece into your community, like no matter where in it, is just so massively important. So you were saying that, you know, you were spending a lot of time in SETU, which is the Southeast Technological University.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you like to see more, you know, institutions around the country follow suit?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was really fantastic because there was Path 4 Phase 1 and 2 funding that happened for universities. So I suppose it is much more common now and it's developing really well. What I liked about ours is that I suppose our learners would have come to us for maybe literacy classes in the past. Not these particular learners, but, you know, learners who come from mild to moderate day services. And I suppose we would have done a BKSB assessment, and don't ask me what that stands for, but it's an assessment to see where they're at. So I suppose we were happy that the learners were at a level 2 and that we could actually collaborate with our partners in higher ed to support them in getting a qualification at a level 2 was really good for us, you know, to achieve that. I suppose I had been previously on the subcommittee of Down Syndrome Ireland in my own branch, and we had kind of looked at how our young adults can get jobs, and we like to see them building up their CV. I mean, it's just the same as everybody else. You know, they will have a better opportunity if they have those level 2 pieces on their CV. So it's about both things. It's about the social engagement, it's about the empowerment, it's about being self-ambassadors, but it's also about the education piece in a real way, to be, you know, enhancing and their CVs and getting them ready for work.
Yeah, and I think all of that piece, it leads to a social currency that I think people who are neurotypical take for granted.
Absolutely.
That piece where you can say, and I know from my own sister, you know, she's a job. She says, you know, I work in this place like a few days a week, and it's just gives them so much social currency that I think a lot of people take for granted otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, to be fair, when I was preparing my son for an interview in the past, he's not very verbal, and I suppose that I saw that disempower him, the interview process and things. So we looked at things like maybe easy to read, where, you know, there's picture representation with words. Now, he wasn't on the course, but just from, you know, learning from, you use what you know. And it was about maybe picture representation, easy to read, one-liners about where you are, leave people talk for themselves. Don't put them through a typical interview process, you know, let people have a trial and see how they, you know, because they'll surprise you with their ability if they get the opportunity. Whereas if we're trying to, make ordinary persons out of them, that's not going to work. It's not always going to work for neurodiverse learners and learners with different skill sets. So I suppose it's about giving people a chance, protecting them, stepping back the way, you know, scaffolding back and off they'll fly, you know. And then, you know, knowing who to call if they have a problem, that's what makes me really proud, when he knows, you know, I can call you, you'll be there if I need you, but leave me go, you know.
And it's empowering people to have the confidence to do all that.
Absolutely.
You know? Well, we've heard, Rosalind, about the brilliant societal changes that programs like My Voice, My Choice can lead to. I'm conscious for any educators who might be listening around Europe or practitioners. I think we do learn our voice really well in Ireland, and this programme particularly is a great example of it. If they're kind of listening in and it's something that they want to start to do or to try, but they kind of don't really know where to begin, particularly with people with maybe additional needs where they're not used to having their voice heard or, you know, expressing what they need. Would you have any advice on kind of where to start with that, or how to support the learners to open up?
Be open to everything, okay? So I suppose what I'm trying to say is we had C2 collaborate with us, but really we had the day services. We had 4 to our backs. We had Down Syndrome Ireland. We had Inclusion Ireland. Look at the advocacy agencies. See what they're doing. Look at their resources. Everybody is willing to share for you know, it's everyone's willing to share the resources with others for the betterment of our learners ultimately, or for anybody really, for learners in general. We were very lucky. There's a couple of really lucky things about us in Waterford and Wexford ETB. We would have learner focus in our strategy. We would have a learner on our board. We would have learners as leaders for our student union that we run. We would have, that would be AINTIS training. We would also have learners learner voice training for our staff. So I suppose that, coupled with universal design, is really important. We're now understanding that there's multiple ways of engagement with our learners, and that we're not to come in as a sage on the stage, more a guide on the side. We're facilitating. Yeah, you're a facilitator. You're here to bring out the best in your learner, not to info dump on them with knowledge, or impressing them with your knowledge. It's about bringing your learners authentically through to the next step, seeing where they're at and meeting them there, giving them resources, making the ask as well. I suppose you really do need to ask learners. Sometimes there's choice. You can engage this way or that way, but sometimes you have to, when you're doing training, you have to get to a line. So, you know, I mean, and sometimes you see learners disengage and you have to ask them, why are you disengaging and how can we achieve this? Because it has to be done, I suppose. Sometimes, you know, it's not boundaryless.
Of course,
and it's about giving people the space and the expectations, and, you know, working together in a group. You have to get group contract and mutual respect, and have zero tolerance for any kind of racism or sexism or ableism, you know, and be open to hearing feedback.
Yeah, it's giving space within a structured environment,
Yes.
I guess is what you could say. Was there anything, and maybe there were several things that you learned from your learners that wouldn't have occurred to you if you were designing this program yourself? Is there anything that really surprised you and helped to shape the program?
Yeah, I suppose I think that the very most important thing is that people are communicating. I suppose one time I got something wrong and I felt really bad about it, but, you know, a young man who had been supported to get to the college, one time he was to go home independently, and I pulled that, you know. We were kind of, can we leave him off, you know, that kind of way. And that was very disempowering, and you felt the mood change, you know, and I suppose it was the communication piece. If we had maybe communicated with the day services, if we had known, we would have been in a better position. So I suppose it really is when you're trying to, when somebody else, when they're coming from a day service, it's really important to having all the information you can. It's also very important that you get as much information from the learner themselves. You know, the learner is an individual. They have a whole host of culture all around them, and they're, you know, they will tell you. So you need to sit down individually with learners to know that they're in the right place and that they want to be on the course. And all about them, really, because we don't just meet them at the door and teach them stuff. You know, it was about empowering them in their own lives, and it's the same with all learners, really. I suppose people decide to be on a course, and that has to be a free decision, and they have to know where they're going at the end of that course, and they have to know the steps that are necessary, and then they will take responsibility for themselves to get to those steps. And, you know, if they're not making it, you can support them, but you're really not there to be dictating to people that they have to do stuff.
It's a two-way thing. It's a conversation, I guess. You're learning from them, they're learning from you, and that collaboration piece is really important when it comes to learner voice. Talk to me a bit, Rosalind, about the EACEA Star Awards and kind of applying for that. You were nominated in the Learner Voice category in 2024, I believe.
That's right. So I suppose I would be involved with the Learner Council, and I would have heard of the Star Awards, and, you know, what I was seeing in the room was really, really powerful. Again, I was addicted to going to this class. You know, I'd kind of handed it over to the tutor at that point. You know, the tutor, there was 2 tutors on the project, and after designing some of the materials, I was starting to step back at that stage. But so I just asked, would we enter for this? And I asked the learners as well, you know, would we enter for this? Explained a bit about the Star Awards, and they said they'd be very, very interested. So I suppose we had a big discussion about who would go and how they would represent us at the interviews. We got nominated, and we got shortlisted. We had 2 wonderful learners, and they had made an extra special effort. You know, they went above and beyond. I think they were all pitching why I should go. You know,
amazing, and healthy competition.
Oh, there was hugely and really wonderful, and there was really great learning in that. You know, and it was all about empowerment. So I suppose we narrowed it down, and when we got down to a very short list ourselves, 2 people came out of the hat. So that was great anyway, and we went to the interview and we went up on the train. It was really empowering again, getting the tickets and booking the spaces and things like that, and it was really close by. We had a lovely day. We were treated like stars, and there was great communication, and we were meeting other groups at the interview process, and it was lovely to be in front of others and maybe reflecting on our course, I suppose, as well. It was very good for our reflection processes about the course. So yeah, so we got shortlisted. We went to the awards on the day. Now that was the best crack ever. So we were really lucky because for the price of an ordinary bus, we got a karaoke bus.
Oh, amazing. Did you? So the whole way up you were preparing?
Yeah, a lot of the way we were preparing. We stopped. We had, we went in, got our lunches. Yeah, there was all sorts of storytelling and crack on the bus. We got to now I actually went as a chaperone. I just went because I was chaperone. Okay, I wasn't meant to be there, but I snuck on the bus and I went to the awards, and it was really wonderful. And when I was there, Connor said, "Oh, look, you got here now, so come in as well," because we had everybody really wanted to go, and for the places they were kind of limited. So there was great singing, there was great dancing, and we met other ETB learners there from Pathfinders and other tutors there as well, and we had a wonderful time, and we were delighted that our peers won the prize. But we were really happy with our certificates because it felt like we were all winners, and we, that was great. And we had a lovely drive back down and singing again and stopping for food and everything.
It's truly to be nominated is such a massive achievement, and it's amazing for yourselves to get that recognition in the category of learner voice, because it is something you do so well in the programme. Rosalind, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It was absolutely fantastic. If anyone listening wants to find out more about My Voice, My Choice, is there anywhere they can go to do that?
Yeah, I suppose as the access officer they can come to me. We're now running one in Wexford at the moment. So, with Waterford and Wexford, we do one in Waterford. Our next one is in Wexford. It's in the Wexford College of FET. Those guys are nearly finished now, and, we're hearing feedback. There's great appetite for them to go on, maybe do a full award or to do further studies in that area. So it's been really successful. People are happy, great feedback, and, it's about more is more.
Brilliant. Yeah, and hopefully it's something that will be replicated across the country.
Brilliant.
I've no doubt. Yeah. Rosalind Threadgold, thank you so much for your time today. That's the Access and Inclusion Officer from Waterford, Wexford ETB. And if you'd like to hear more of our Enhance podcasts or find out more about the project, you can head along to enhancelearnervoice.com.